With me today, Director of Planning and Development, Elizabeth Jenkins. We're going to talk short-term rentals and really what the law that was recently passed, what it really means for the town of Barnstable, and perhaps maybe some new regulatory issues surrounding it. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Paula. Good to be here and good to be talking to you and the public about this topic.
Right, so it's been a hot button topic, especially as we come off of summer. You know, it was the first year that people had to report actual income on their short-term rentals. But let's first start with, what is a short-term rental?
Right. So you're absolutely right. How did we start this conversation? The governor passed an act regulating and ensuring short-term rentals that requires people now who are hosting short-term rentals to pay a tax, much like a hotel or motel would. So you have to register now. If you're a host, you have to register them with the DOR. But part of this legislation also, again, defined what's a short-term rental specifically, so we sort of understand what this specific land use is, as well as gave municipalities sort of explicit authorization to regulate it for. So stepping back, what is a short-term rental? So it's a rental of a dwelling unit. Typically we think about it as a single-family home, but I guess it could be a multi-family home or an apartment as well. And it is rented for not more than 31 days at a time, so 30 days or less at any one time, and not more than 14 days total in a calendar year. So again, it's not your hotel, your motel, bed and breakfast. You know, it's nothing. Right. It's not a month-to-month lease or a timeshare. It's really what a lot of us think about as something you would see again on sites such as Airbnb or VRBO. And you know, that's just one way, I think, to think about a short-term rental. There are, again, multiple ways that these have always existed in our community. You know, we're a coastal seasonal community, so weekly rentals through a broker or a leasing agent. Again, that's that would qualify under the law as a short-term rental as well. And something that again, I think feels much more familiar in our community. It's the rise of these platforms, the Airbnb, the VRBO, that have led to just an exponential growth in the number of short-term rentals and their availability that are out there, and really sort of has begun to change the nature of the use a little bit. But in terms of time frames, it's that 30 days or less to any one person, and as a whole, 2 weeks out of the year, rented for more than 2 weeks out of the year.
Right. And you kind of, you know, when we go through this whole workshop presentation that you've given out there for, you know, several dog and pony shows, owner, resident occupied, you know, seasonal investor owned, what kind of really, is this a classification in categories of the types of dwellings that are?
Right. So I think one thing that's important to remember, again, is there's sort of this overriding definition, but you can lump a lot of different things into that category. You know, when Airbnb started, the idea was that, oh, you had an extra room in your house and you'd rent it out for a few days, and you know, maybe you'd share a cup of soup or you know, a cup of coffee with people. So, you know, a person was present in their home. You know, it wasn't sort of the overriding use of that property. But that's just, you know, one piece on one side of the spectrum. You know, the other side of the spectrum you see is, again, somebody who buys a property for the purposes of renting it out all year as a short-term rental. You know, they're not necessarily, they don't live in the home. They're not in the home all the time. So that's sort of the other side. And then there's some sort of variations in between. Again, is somebody going to be there? Is somebody going to be sort of in contact all the time? So I think, you know, as we start to think about approaching this as a community, it's just important to remember that there are sort of short-term rentals might be one animal, but there's some, you know, there's some sort of different categories in there.
Right, and classifications. You know, some, you know, it could be a second homeowner who's not ready to retire yet, but has decided to purchase their investment property and say, well, geez, you know, maybe I can, you know, make this a second income or something to that effect.
Exactly, which again is something common. We see pretty common, but again, as it becomes easier and easier to do short-term rentals, we see other variations as well. So again, I just think it's important to think about again, all of those in context as, as we think about regulations. So one of the things we really wanted to do when we started this process was to understand what do short-term rentals look like here in Barnstable, because again, we know we're a seasonal community. We've started to hear from some residents about sort of different activity, a level of activity in short-term rentals. So we partnered up with a consultant team to start to analyze at least the online short-term rental data. Again, those ones that you see through the different web platforms, the big ones being Airbnb, VRBO, Expedia, to sort of, they have an ability to sort of sort through that data. And what we see is that we know that a lot of our traditional rentals are included in there as well. So one of the things that we saw is that, in Barnstable, we think we have about 950 to 1,000 active short-term rentals overall. And, that number is good to keep in context. We have 24,000 overall dwelling units in the town of Barnstable. So, about 1,000 of these 24,000 are short-term rentals. So again, good in terms of context. You get a town like Provincetown, and they see, again, as an overall percentage of their overall of their dwelling units, they see that number much higher, where ours is again maybe 3% of our overall housing stock. So we understand about how many there are out there. And again, these are snapshots. These are snapshots in time. The other thing we know is that short-term rentals come on and off the market at a really rapid pace. When we started monitoring data, when we first started to when we last started, the difference was about 400. Wow. That had either new come on or old come off. So very variable market out there. What we do know is sort of we've tried to figure out where they are in town. So not surprisingly, precincts 1, 4, 5, and 13, which are Barnstable Village, Osterville, the Centerville, Craigville, and Hyannis, West Hyannisport. That's where
ocean access, really.
Exactly, places that again are more seasonal, that have sort of more appeal to tourists, and are close to the ocean. So not to say that's where they all are, but I think about 70% of our short-term rentals are in these precincts. Sort of where you would expect them.
That data, as you went out and had somebody help you kind of gather this, the analysis of this now, where does that kind of fit into what you're looking at to kind of have people understand this industry? It's an industry. Just like a B&B is an industry, is different from a hotel industry. This short-term rental industry is different from the two of those.
Exactly. So what we're really trying to do is understand what it looks like on the ground here in Barnstable. And so if we make a policy decision to regulate it, what's important to people about it, and what are we regulating for? So another really important statistic that's out there, I think, is that about 90% of our properties here in town are managed by just one host. So a single homeowner has one short-term rental. You're not seeing, again, what you see in Boston, which are outside investors who are coming in and buying up huge tracts of their new multifamily development, which they're trying so hard to get. And again, somebody coming in, buying a big handful of properties and taking them off the market. That's not really what we see here on the Cape. We're not seeing that sort of off-Cape speculative investment. We're seeing, again, mostly people who more than likely own the home are renting out their rentals. So again, in terms of establishing or thinking about policy or what we want to regulate for here, I think understanding that is important. Again, not exclusively, but for the most part, one rental unit, one host. The other thing is that what we see is the vast majority of our rentals are people who are renting out their entire house. They're not doing that traditional Airbnb. I'm just going to rent out a room. Again, we're going to do this sort of shared and incidental situation. They're really renting out their whole house at a time. So I think, again, as we think about approaches to this, those are really positive. Again, there's some positives in there because, again, I think what a lot of communities are responding to in terms of regulation are speculative speculative investors coming in and buying big properties. Really, the short-term rental market interfering with the year-round housing market, and I think we see that a little less here. Again, when you start to look at the precincts, I think most of the short-term rentals are in homes that are, probably between $600,000 to $1 million, which is really out of the reach of most, most people who are looking for starter homes or workforce housing units. So that's sort of good in the way the data plays out. And again, the other thing is that 1,000 seems like a lot, but probably a lot of overlap again with sort of those traditional weekly rentals we see here. We've talked to some brokers and agents, and we understand that they're using that as another way of advertising.
Right. So let's bring that down to cottage colonies, right? There's a few out those in Craigville, and then over on the north side as well. Those cottage colonies have been traditional rentals, seasonal rentals for years. So they're just using the platform now to try to get more, what they used to say, heads and beds.
Right, exactly. So again, I think as we start to understand exactly what short-term rentals look like in Barnstable, it helps us understand, again, as a community, how we might want to approach that regulation. And so I think what we know is as we talk to residents that, again, if you're here as a visitor, if you're renting out a whole house, maybe you don't have the same sort of awareness of neighbors and neighborhoods and rules and regulations in Barnstable that most people have. So it's probably good to make sure that there's very sort of open and clear communication, both with people who are renting the dwelling, the hosts that are renting the dwelling, as well as the people who are staying in the dwelling, visitors in our community. So we have a lot of regulations for everybody who lives here all year round. We have building code regulations and health regulations and Title V.
Noise and trash.
Noise and exactly all those things where you want to be really, you want to both take care of your property in a safe way and be a really good neighbor. But I think what we're finding is, again, we have to make sure, instead of all of these regulations sort of smattered all over the place, that we have some really good tools in place to be able to, again, sort of put those all together for a host or for a visitor and communicate out to them. So we feel like that's probably a good common ground to start with in terms of regulation. But that's not to say that our community might not want to look at sort of, again, other options depending on our objectives. Is do we want to take a closer look at housing supply? Do we want to take a closer look at the impacts of speculative investment? Our short-term rentals, do we see short-term rentals being used more intensely, more occupants than others? There are obviously different impacts of short-term rentals in different places. So I think that's a consideration to talk through as well. As well as, again, recognition that we're a seasonal community, that these make a positive economic impact by allowing more visitors and guests. If you have more visitors here, then they spend more at local businesses. So how do we take that into consideration as well? So these are, again, all things that we're sort of, I think, talking to our policymakers about, and we'd also like to talk to the community about here in the future.
Right. So I want to just step back a little bit and kind of go back to the good neighbor thing, right? So, if you're living in a residential neighborhood and you notice a neighbor now renting out their house for whatever reason in this style, in this short-term rental, what is the dialogue that the person who's renting should have with their neighbors? Like, I'm a beekeeper, so I went and I sent a little note to all of my neighbors that abut me and said, I have honey for you, maybe. But they'll certainly pollinate your gardens. They're harmless. So, upfront communication usually works well than behind the 8-ball, correct?
That's what we think as well. Again, if you own a property in a neighborhood, it's good to reach out to your neighbors, let them know let them know what you're doing. Again, let them know if something is not going wrong. Of course, obviously, if you feel unsafe, call the police. But here's another. Again, here are sort of other town outlets that you can call. We think something that's sort of critical to some sort of local regulation would have a host be available sort of on a 24/7 basis.
Sure.
So they have somebody to, a neighbor who has concern would have somebody to call and be responsive with at all times. And there are actually tools and companies out here that help you monitor all of those listings,
Sure.
again, that provide those contact information for people, have a 24-hour hotline, for example. So there are some sort of tools and technologies that we could partner with to make this viable for both us to administer as a town and I think our residents to live with as neighbors. But I think that gets part of this sort of back to part of this foundational regulation was that, again, we hope most people will do that, but
Right.
being able to, again, mandate or the images you saw up on the screen, again, give people some sort of tools for those communications. That was a great example. I think it came out of Colorado Springs, again,
Right.
sort of handouts that they gave people to require them to post in dwelling units.
So I guess, to wrap this up, this is a fluid process.
Yep.
Obviously, most regulatory processes are until they get set in stone. How do residents and/or homeowners who might be contemplating or already have one of these types of short-term rentals, how do they get involved in the process? What do you want them to do?
Sure. So our next step is we've been working with the town council and a subcommittee of that council that's specifically focused on zoning and regulation. With their cooperation, we're going to reach out to the civic associations around town,
Okay.
again, and look for feedback from them. We've put together a survey to just sort of help start this conversation and get people thinking about the different issues around short-term rentals. So we hope to roll that out here very shortly and make that available to folks. We also have an updated town webpage, information about short-term rentals.
Right.
Again, all the the sort of logistics and statistics that we've talked about here today will be available up there. Information again about if you're a host, the DOR regulations, if you're a neighbor and you have concerns, who are the best people to sort of reach out to under our current regulations. And then you can put your name and email in there as well if you want to sort of stay up to date on future meetings and this conversation.
Fantastic. Well, it's a conversation we'll continue to have. Thanks so much for updating us.
Great, of course. Thanks for having me.